In the early 1990s, shortly after the collapse of the USSR, the political theorist Francis Fukuyama declared that we were entering into a new period in the future, a period that would bring about what he called the end of history. And in his book, The End of History and the Last Man, he described his theory as essentially saying that new economic systems and new liberalized political orders that swept across the world would bring about a period where human struggle and human strife, the problems therein, were essentially solved. Now, Fukuyama was heavily criticized for this assessment, and even a few years after he wrote the book that I mentioned, he revised them. But I do think, in a very different sense than Fukuyama meant it, we have reached a point in our culture, in our country, where history is ending and where we are entering a post-historical period. And I think that this epoch that we're about to enter, if I may even use a historical word to describe a sort of anti-historical phenomenon, is quite concerning, and it could lead to us forgetting the truths that are essential for us as thinking people, us as Americans, us as denizens of the West, from understanding, appreciating, and preserving our civilization. So in this video, we're going to explore this new end of history, and I'm going to discuss some ways that it might be countered through means of intellection and through means of course, understanding the problem. But before we get into that, friends, hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that we get our messages out there, even if you disagree with me. I am so excited, my friends. We are so close to 20,000 subscribers. I believe something very special is on the horizon. And I think that people need to have a message that is deeper than what they have been getting, that is more substantive. And so if that's something that you're interested in, then I would encourage you to, again, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. Now, please enjoy the video. So, when I say we have entered into a post-historical period, and when I say that we are into a period that could mark the end of history, we must first understand what history is, and then we must understand how history has been conceptualized throughout time, and then we must understand how exactly history as it is evolving into something that is fundamentally anti-historical. So what is history? This is actually a question that a lot of different ideologies have different answers of. In my view, and this is, I think, the most sensible view, this is the view that many in the Enlightenment had, and this is the view that I think is most empirically justifiable. History is nothing more than a story that we write ourselves every single day. In other words, history is a record of sorts, a sort of book that documents the things that have happened in our past, things that have happened in our present, and it gives us perhaps insights into things that can happen into the future. It is both a reference point and a guide, but it is not a gospel. It is not this indispensable fount of wisdom. Like any record, history can be altered, or history can miss certain things or have certain things omitted from it by those who happen to write history. And since history is a product of the human imagination, we should indeed expect it not to be flawless, but to have some level of errors. Now, with this conception of history, we reach a certain problem. And that problem tends to be the problem of what people call historical revisionism. A lot of people will decry historical revisionism because they believe that it is fundamentally rewriting history. But historical revisionism is actually a necessary mechanism to preserve, or at least to recover, truths that were hidden over by those who wrote the record in the first place. For example, a very tangible example of this is what happened during the Progressive Era. A lot of academic historians wrote a history of the Progressive Era that was more like a hagiography, more like a praise of that period of time and a sort of very positive assessment of it, as opposed to an objective assessment of what happened during that time and the effects of that time on the present day. In other words, history can be written as a hagiography, or can be written as a realistic document. And when it is not written properly, the revisionist goes in and corrects what was the wrong that was done. So revisionism is actually important. Others may even say that erasing history is the true problem. If we erase our history, then that means we'll be able to learn from it. Well, the issue with that is, it's impossible to erase what is imprinted upon the art, especially when those things have been passed down generation after generation. Again, history being a record is a record that is fundamentally experienced by all of us because it is a product of action. If you, for example, learned about the Revolutionary War as a kid, you're going to remember certain details, even if they're incorrect, such as George Washington chopped down a cherry tree or whatever, and these details will still be imprinted upon your consciousness. So it's very impossible to erase that which we have an active role in perpetuating and understanding and writing. But the true danger when it comes to history is when people reinterpret history according to singular ideas that do not give themselves over to intellectual correction. And that is the primary problem that we have today in our society, is that history, the past, is not being seen through the eyes of the present. It is in fact being reinterpreted through the lens of totalitarian, totalistic ideas, unfeasible ideas, fundamentally abstract ideas that, when upon further scrutiny, are not justified. And then that interpretation is being imposed upon us, not as a epistemological thing, as a thing that we learn, but as a moral mandate, something that we must do to correct some harm. So it's quite important to understand this between historical erasure, historical revisionism, and this new thing that I'm saying is going to usher in the end of history, which is historical reinterpretation. So for example, let's say there is a particular historical narrative that is being acted upon, because all of those three things act upon some kind of narrative. So let's say, for example, taking the Pete Hegseth example, the origins of Deus Vult. So Deus Vult being a Latin phrase that says God wills it, which was first used in the Crusades in the 11th century by Pope Urban II to galvanize the Crusaders into going and reclaiming Jerusalem, because that gave them this sense that they were acting not out of some kind of political fealty or not out of some kind of worldly ambition, but instead they were acting with the express will of God, therefore Deus Vult. So we have that established. Historical erasure will say, well, we're going to completely annihilate that and forget that even ever existed. That did not exist whatsoever. What existed was an XYZ. Historical revisionism would say, okay, that may have existed, but it existed in this way, not that way. Pope Urban didn't really motivate the use of that phrase. They didn't actually think that God was ruling their action. They actually thought X, Y, Z, and there may be some tinkering. Historical reinterpretation would say, oh yes, that happened, that existed, Pope Urban indeed motivated it, the Templars and the Crusaders indeed believed they were going towards reclaiming holy lands for God's will, and that's why it's supremacist. Or whatever idea that the historical reinterpretationist wants to impose upon the particular narrative, to box it out from any other consideration and to narrow it to an ideological consideration. Whenever you're trying to understand a topic, you must understand it first for what it is, not for what your worldview would tell you it is. And the mark of wisdom is being able to separate your worldview from the evaluation of facts. You can, after you know facts and after you understand their significance, you can then indeed try to apply your worldview towards it with reason, but your worldview should fit facts. Facts should not fit your worldview, because if facts fit your worldview, they no longer are facts. They are merely convenient tools for you to use to justify your belief, when in all reality, those tools may go against your belief. This is the concept of direction of fit in philosophy that so many people just don't understand. So it's very important to understand this when talking about the historical reinterpretationists, because this can then therefore annihilate understanding of the past in a way that effectively kills our ability to not only interpret the past, but continue writing the record of history into the future. Many of you may remember very recently when President Trump announced he was having Pete Hegseth be his nominee for the Secretary of Defense, which, by the way, is an incredibly significant nomination for a wide range of reasons, and I'll run over some of them for you. The Pentagon is actually at the epicenter of shaping United States defense policy. It's also the epicenter of shaping the norms and culture of our military. It's also the epicenter, fundamentally, of the homeland defense. And so whoever is in charge of the Pentagon actually, fundamentally, is in charge of the culture of our military, is in charge of the security of our country, is in charge of the ethos of our military, and fundamentally, they're in charge of shaping the perspectives of the president as it relates to war and military readiness. It's a massive position. And so this is obviously a very significant role for anyone to be promoted to. But the moment Pete Hegseth was announced, the corporate media, like vultures, swooped down and began scrutinizing everything about him. And they decided, instead of focusing on substance, to focus on aesthetics. And they criticized two things. Pete Hegseth had a Deus Vult tattoo on his arm, and he also had a old-style medieval cross tattoo on his arm as well. And the very important thing about these two things is that they immediately tried to call these symbols, these icons, symbols of a white supremacy. Indeed, Hegseth was called a white supremacist for having an old Latin phrase which simply means, as God wills it, which goes back all the way to the Crusades, upon his arm. He was considered to be a white supremacist simply by having a certain cross tattooed upon his arm. And the response to this invective rhetoric from the right was primarily to call the media anti-Christian. But it wasn't to evaluate the deeper anti-historical phenomenon that this line of attack actually represents. See, what this line of attack represents is actually, it was an attempt to collapse human discourse and human understanding of our civilizations and the roots of certain things to the last few decades of cultural conversation that have been dominated by tyrannical ideas that, when questioned, erect a moral question mark over the questioner. White supremacy is actually one of these ideas, because the term white supremacy has been reinterpreted to mean a variety of different things, and oftentimes it basically simply means having a certain position of power and having a certain status. But these things are linked closely towards race, and race, being the hot button and emotionally fueled topic that it is, tends to evoke a certain kind of reaction to people, especially when it is used as a weapon against a dissenting opinion, so much so that it can change fundamentally the patterns of how one thinks. And so the attempt to say that his crosses and Deus Vult or white supremacist were to fundamentally brand Pete Hegseth and anyone that supported him as a racist, and therefore shut him down on that basis. But beyond character assassination, if this had succeeded, I don't think it succeeded, but if this had succeeded, it would also reinterpret and revolutionize how people see basic historical symbols that have a much broader and a much richer context to them. A context that cannot be understood by the context set by these dominant principles that oftentimes do not lend themselves well to scrutiny. In other words, the end of history that I'm talking about is an end of understanding how to interpret history properly, how to understand the roots of things like symbols and words properly, and how to consider a variety of perspectives when understanding those things and looking back through time, and instead simply imposing one idea or another idea upon those things and then forgetting everything else and dismissing it. It's a kind of tunnel vision that can lead to nothing more than a drought of knowledge and a drought of proper understanding that is needed to approach and understand things that may seem strange to us. Now, historical knowledge is already at risk due to the increase of digitization. It's already at risk due to the fact that paper is being discarded, books are being discarded, print is being discarded, and we're seeing a rise in digital record keeping, which, by the way, is efficient, but it's also dangerous because the digital is fundamentally ephemeral. The digital can be edited or taken away or revoked at the whim of whoever controls the system. This is precisely why I advocate owning DVDs, or I advocate owning paperback books over streaming or over getting Kindle, because the moment someone who is in control of the system and has the code decides they don't want you to watch something, they can quite easily revoke those things. We've seen this happen over the past 2 years. You may have even seen it happen in a rather mundane sense. Whenever you're going on your Amazon TV, or you're going on whatever streaming platform you prefer, or Netflix, to look for a movie, they may have had it for X amount of months, but they may have then also decided to revoke it after a certain period of time, and now you can't access it. And if you had no digital counterpart to that, that movie is now inaccessible to you. Well, if you think about this in terms of knowledge, in terms of how we can record keep the things about our civilization that make it what it is, and guide how we learn, then not only is this going beyond a mere inconvenience, that inconvenience is entertainment, this can actually fundamentally inconvenience us and change the way we learn about our past. So that is already the practical concern with, I think, the modern age. But if you combine that practical concern, the fact that the sort of digitization of everything makes things ephemeral, with the philosophical concern that interpreting everything according to a dominant paradigm that is unrelenting and does not consider other perspectives, you have a perfect recipe to essentially end how we should properly see history and how we interact with the past. This is a crisis. This is a massive crisis. And I think that we have to deal with this in a manner that is going to be swift, and a manner that is going to preserve this sort of traditional way of how we understand things. Fukuyama was flawed in his thinking, and that political organization is not the panacea for human problems. It does not solve all human problems. So long as human nature exists, there will be problems that are attendant to it, that manifest in civilization, that manifest in politics, wars, famine, poverty, disease. These things will still happen. But political organization can absolutely make human development much harder, as we have seen with totalitarian regimes and how they restrict the life growth of human potential. And I think that this changing of how we see history, changing of how history is dealt with, is indeed one of those ways that can indeed make human development much harder. Without a reference point, it is impossible to learn anything. Without a reference point or a guide, it is impossible to glean wisdom. And without a reference point or a guide, it is impossible to create a standard upon a correct foundation, because as we know, novelty is not really a thing in the new world. A lot of things that have happened now have happened before, but there are new interpretations of those things that our actions can do that can give them new life and perhaps have new meaning for us here in the modern era. Now, I must say, it is not just the social justice activists who interpret everything through the lens of white supremacy who have the entire pursuit of history wrong. Unfortunately, there are a lot of ideologies that have almost deific views of history that lead them to wrong conclusions. And whenever those ideologies are in power in society, or they have some influence over our institutions, we can see the ruinous effects of them manifest in some way, shape, or form, even if those ways are rather small. For example, Oswald Spengler, who was a German philosopher of history, if you can call him that, viewed history and civilization much like one would view the life cycle of a plant. He believed that history was born much like an organism is born, and that it went through this deterministic cycle where it would eventually die. And he basically laid out this entire map of how civilizations were supposed to progress according to his mechanism, and he believed that things unfolded according to this, and that civilizations ended in a kind of Caesarian dictatorship. The Marxists believe that history unfolds also according to this mechanical system of laws that ultimately end up in the conflict between the rich and the poor, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which will then usher in this sort of classist society. The sort of Fukuyama neoliberals believe, again, that you have this new political system that comes in, and then all of a sudden, all human problems are solved. The transhumanists believe that at the end of history, you get something that is greater than the human being. You get the transcendence of human limitations, and you get a sort of new, different existence. I don't care who it is. I don't care if it is the Fukuyama neoliberal. I don't care if it's the Spenglerian astrologist, because essentially it's just astrology is all it is. I don't care if it's the Marxist. I don't care if it's the transhumanist. These ideas about history fundamentally omit that history does not move unless you and I move. That history does not move unless I apply my free will and my creative will to impacting the world around me. That history is not a matter of deterministic laws and classes and systems and institutions and power. History is a matter of intention, of intellection, of reason, of creativity, of free will, of daringness, of virtue. And all of these things happen on the ground level and they go up. That's why Spengler was not able to explain America. That's why when Spengler was pressed about America, he simply said, well, America is just it's a offshoot of Europe. It's not really even a civilization, because he couldn't understand how something could exist without following his rigid system. And that is what we as Americans must claim. Our birthright is not just that of freedom. Our birthright is that of putting to shame the bad ideas that have held back human progress, that have held back the development of society, that have held back real enlightenment, real moral enlightenment, that have held back the human species for so long. Our birthright is breaking off the yokes of totalizing ideas that limited our thinking and kept us bound to caste and status systems. Our birthright is a continuation of this sort of enlightenment tradition of bringing forth the truth into the future so that all can see its merits. Our birthright is one that says history is not written necessarily by the victors. It's written by its participants. And we are all participants in our own destiny. If we recognize that and acknowledge that, we can thwart the end of history. And I think bring about the continuation of a fruitful way to see our past. But if we get lost in these different systems of thought, these different philosophies that are dead ends, and we get lost in the dominant paradigms of our day, and we interpret everything according to those dominant ideas, then I think not only will history end, but civilization may very well follow right along with it. Because we understand that a civilization that does not understand how to approach reality will ultimately be decided. Its course will be decided by those who firmly reject reality. So my friends, what choice do you make? Do you choose to acknowledge the role we play in making and destiny making in this world? Or do you choose to leave it to some system that is far beyond you and that supposedly has all the answers and that we should just submit to? I know what I choose, and I hope that you choose the right thing as well. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to get our message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.